Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon or good evening, depending where you are in the world right now. It's indeed my pleasure to welcome you all on our panel on Gendering the Struggle for Human Rights, International Experiences. This panel is organized by Hafıza Merkezi Berlin as part of our project on defending others, liberating themselves, the experiences of women human rights defenders in Turkey. My name is Duru Yavan, and I will be moderating today's panels. In this project, I worked as a researcher with Hafıza Merkezi Berlin and its partner organization, International Service for Human Rights. Our aim for today is to discuss the opportunities and limitations of feminist intervention in the field of human rights. Since many years, feminist activists have been challenging and criticizing the human rights field through its concepts, mechanisms, and institutions. And accordingly, many feminist activists generally refrain from using the human rights narrative in their struggle against patriarchy and heteronormativity, and they prefer to stay outside of the human rights field as much as possible. Yet, on the other hand, there are other feminists rather prefer to remain in the field of human rights, holding spaces, transforming its concepts, and strategically using its narrative tools, and mechanisms to foster their feminist activism, including at the UN level and at the national level. Today, we will be listening to our distinguished and valuable guests, Carrie Shelver from Sexual Rights Initiative, Pooja Patel from International Service for Human Rights, Meerim Ilyas from Frontline Defenders, and Brenda Kugonza, Women's Defenders Network, Uganda, who are involved in feminist activism, yet also working in the field of human rights at different levels and in different geographies. They will be sharing their own experiences with us today, their lessons learned, and the challenges they face, so that we can discuss together what does feminist intervention to the human rights field in Turkey look like, or could look like. So we have a lot to cover today, and I would like to give the floor very soon to Pooja, that we will start with Pooja's presentation. But before I do that, I would like to remind you that please feel free to type your questions or any comments that you might have in the chat section of YouTube. It should be on the right corner of your screen. So now I think we can start with Pooja. Pooja is from International Service for Human Rights, and she will share with us her experiences of bringing a feminist analysis to the human rights defender framework at the UN level. And she will discuss the relevance of the concept women human rights defenders in this regard. So Pooja, you are going to talk about the relevance of the term women human rights defenders, and I would like to briefly mention what's it about and give you the floor quickly. So the term women human rights defenders, which actually derives from the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, and through this declaration in 1998, the states at the UN level have universally agreed to recognize the right to defend human rights and declared that they will provide a safe and enabling environment for human rights defenders to do their critical work. However, unfortunately, we see that in Turkey and in all regions of the world, the threats and attacks to human rights defenders and to speech freedoms in general are increasing concerns. The context that should enable the work of human rights defenders are being progressively eroded. And women human rights defenders who have engaged at the UN system and specifically with the UN Human Rights Defenders Protection Mechanism have worked to evolve and strengthen human rights defenders' protection by bringing important feminist analysis to this framework. Women human rights defenders began their engagement almost 2 decades ago with a seemingly simple call. Women human rights defenders are women who work to promote and protect human rights, and all persons coming from different genders who promote and protect the rights of women and gender equality in general. They stress that due to the patriarchal and heteronormative context in which we conduct our human rights work, the challenges we face are specific to our gender, and this requires specific types of protection. Today, they still continue their engagement for a more inclusive definition of women human rights defenders, as well as for a deconstruction of the principle of protection, accountability, and justice. So Pooja, I would like to give you the floor now so that you could introduce yourself briefly and talk about what are you doing at ISHR regarding the Women Human Rights Defenders framework. And maybe you can also talk about the feminist struggle behind the term Women Human Rights Defenders and what does it mean, why it is important, and how does it work in practice. So the floor is yours, Pooja.
Thank you so much, Duru, and hello to everybody who is listening in today. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you all. So I think that Duru gave a really excellent framing and a background, and I think just to go into a little bit more of the history, as Duru has already pointed out, there's a historical significance around the Human Rights Defenders Declaration because it was the first time that the right to defend human rights was formally recognized. But like with anything else that happens at the UN, it also represents a negotiated outcome. And so at the time, there were also many NGOs and human rights defenders who were engaging with that process who were quite disappointed and felt that this was, the minimum standard. And so, so there has also been a lot of work that has happened since the adoption of the declaration to try to strengthen those standards in various ways, including through different resolutions, including through working with different UN experts, etc. The very term human rights defenders is also one that is contested. You know, there were different proposals at the time. You know, do we call them activists, civil society representatives? And in the end, what happened was that it was the Western countries that were using the term human rights defenders in their informal negotiations. And in fact, the official title of the declaration doesn't even mention human rights defenders. The official name of the declaration is the UN Declaration on the Rights and Responsibilities of All Individuals and Groups and Organs of Society to Promote and Protect Universally Recognized Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. Either way, whether it's human rights defenders or this longer title, it's clear that the right to defend rights centers those rights that are recognized and enshrined in international law. And then you had the women activists, women human rights defenders, who are engaged with the process, who also, after its adoption, really also rallied to ensure a more gender responsive framework. Many of those who led this work were feminists who were also leading the feminist engagement at the conference that led to the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. So soon after the Human Rights Defenders Declaration was adopted, these same feminists were among a group who created the Women Human Rights Defenders International Coalition. It was born out of a global conference of more than 200 women human rights defenders, and it's a global coalition that brings together human rights NGOs and feminist NGOs. And the starting point for their work was to put forward that women human rights defenders require explicit recognition for their presence, work, and contribution in human rights movements at the national, regional, and international level. Theirs is not only work related to gender equality, but they make work on all areas related to human rights. For this work, for the same work, they are at risk of many of the same threats, intimidation, attacks as their male colleagues. For example, judicial harassment, arbitrary detention, disappearances. However, or maybe furthermore, because women defenders are doing this work in a very particular context of patriarchy and heteronormativity, and the very act of them doing this work in these kinds of contexts is seen as challenging a certain status quo, their experiences with these violations are specific to their gender. So the Women Human Rights Defenders International Coalition and many other women human rights defenders have been engaging with the UN system to unpack these experiences and to speak about what their challenges and their needs are, and to ensure that their struggles and their activism is also reflected at the international level. I would say that also in the last 5 to 7 years, we have seen a resurgence in the UN spaces, particularly in the Human Rights Council, of very principled feminist engagement. And by this, I mean activists and organizations that undertake an explicitly feminist agenda rather than a human rights agenda, who center feminist practices in their work, and they seek to influence the outcomes and decisions of the UN from that perspective. And what the contributions that they have brought to the framework on human rights defenders at the UN are the following. So the first thing is that they've disrupted the very idea of protection, because under the Declaration of Human Rights Defenders, it is seen that the state is a duty bearer and has the obligation to protect human rights defenders. Feminists have said, rightly, that the state itself is the perpetrator. And they have been quite good at shifting the discourse towards one where states must recognize, respect, and support self-defined forms of protection, including collective and community protection. in addition, they've also really been strong in advocating for naming the perpetrators. They highlighted that, you only name the violation and the victim. You need to name the perpetrators. And so this has been a major call to the UN experts. And in the work to name perpetrators, also to unpack the power dynamics, to address the complicity of multiple actors that may be relevant to a single case, that a single case is never a single case, but is linked to the experiences of communities and movements. And then an ongoing area of work is disrupting the idea of accountability and justice. How can the UN move beyond looking at judicial remedies to violations to one that addresses root causes and surfaces the structural and systemic changes that need to occur? So these are the kinds of contributions that a feminist engagement has been making in the Human Rights Council. Bringing a lot of their practices, their ideas, their solutions from their own movements into these global spaces. And so, yeah, I think I will leave it there for the moment.
Thank you very much, Pooja. That was a great introduction. I would like to ask you, as you are working at International Service for Human Rights, an international human rights organization, and you mainly aiming to assist women human rights defenders coming from different parts of the world, and you try to assist them on how they can most effectively use UN human rights mechanisms. Could you please tell us more about what their experiences have been? Women human rights defenders' experiences have been, because you also mentioned during your presentation that women human rights defenders international coalitions and other advocates are trying to somehow unpack this specific experiences of women human rights defenders.
So I mentioned kind of the contributions that they've made in terms of where they have stretched the framework to date, but they've done this within a context that hasn't been particularly easy. It's been a very challenging context at the UN level. First of all, the UN itself, it's a bit of a labyrinth, it's a very technical space where you really need to know the methods of work, the rules of procedures, how do you engage? It can be slow, it can be bureaucratic, it can be quite heavy. At the same time, women defenders have faced multiple barriers for their engagement and participation. It could be in relation to resources, but also, often already the work that they're doing at the local and national level is stretches them so far that they often don't have the additional time or resources to then spend on doing international advocacy. It's also a space where often it can be a bit male dominated, and when you have very specific agenda at the UN, it's not always the women defenders who are coming to represent their civil society or their human rights movement. And then also in some ways, the UN, the Human Rights Council, the political space, it's a mirror of what's happening at the national level as well. So if you have increasingly authoritarian populist governments that are coming into power, they are sending their representatives to the UN. So they are it also becomes an increasingly authoritarian and a populist space as well. And so when you have that kind of context also at the UN, and rights are being undermined and traded off, sometimes, not sometimes, often we also find that the first point of attack tends to be rights related to bodily autonomy. It tends to be rights related to sexual reproductive health and rights, to the rights of women to advocate for change, women's political participation, etc. You also see increasingly powerful non-state actors So religious groups, religious organizations and associations are extremely well funded, and they are in that space, and they are so feminists, women human rights defenders are not only challenging the state in these spaces, they are also having to face civil society who are conservative, who also have kind of an agenda that seeks to co-opt, I think, a lot of the human rights narratives that we have. And of course, I think if some of you followed the COP26, the recent negotiations around climate change, you saw that that corporate interests are extremely powerful also in multilateral spaces. And it's the same at the Human Rights Council as well. On the agenda to do with business and human rights, you in fact see business as big players there. It's also the UN space has proven sometimes to not be the safest space for human rights defenders, who sometimes have faced backlash for the work that they have done in their engagement with the UN. And so there have been multiple challenges. I think it's a very difficult context, but at the same time, the interest and the level of engagement of feminists and women human rights defenders have not decreased. In fact, they have increased. We see more and more interest. At ISHR, we do a lot of trainings on UN advocacy. And by and large, the majority of the applications that we get are from women human rights defenders. And so we are also interrogating, why that is. And one of there are many reasons. I think some of the reasons are more cynical than others. But what we find is that certainly I think that as space closes at the national level to advance issues where it becomes increasingly more dangerous to very publicly and vocally exercise rights, a lot of activists at the national level are seeking to create that space through their engagements at the UN. And there is also kind of two sides of the UN human rights system. There is the political process, which is representation by member states. But then there's also another part, which is the expert processes, independent experts of the UN who can also make contributions to push for change. And you see that a lot of women defenders and activists, especially engaging more with the experts mechanisms, seeking to strengthen norms and standards through their work with independent experts. And then finally, I think that there is work to be done around accountability at the international level as well, and to ensure that what is the agenda that is being pushed at the international level through their foreign policy, and what is the reality on the ground, that these are also exposed.
Thank you very much, Pooja. That was really interesting. If I may, I have another question for you. As you know, as part of this project, we have been conducting a research on the experiences of women who are working in the field of human rights in Turkey. Mm-hmm. And what we have observed is that the term women human rights defenders is quite like a foreign term for us. It's being seen as a Western term, as some kind of a word that was created at the UN level, which doesn't project necessarily what we have experienced in the field, at the local context. And there are also, of course, some political sensitivities around the concept, and many women prefer to identify themselves as feminists, activists, or use different terms, but they do not want to identify themselves with the term women human rights defenders. And in a way, they really don't want to somehow squeeze their political struggle into some terms created at the UN level. Have you encountered similar sensitivities in different geographies when you are working with women human rights defenders? And how do you interpret these sensitivities? How do you deal with them?
I think that's a very important and pertinent question. So at the very practical level, I would say the following. At the practical level, you do not have to identify as a woman human rights defender in order to engage with any of the UN processes, mechanisms, bodies, or institutions. These are mechanisms that exist, and as activists, as defenders, you may want to use them strategically to leverage your own change agenda or not. But if you choose to do so, it is not necessary to identify as a human rights defender. The second thing I would say is that you also do not have to identify as a human rights defender in order for the protection framework of human rights defenders to be applicable to you. So if you have faced an attack or reprisal for the work that you do, whether it be things, it could be distributing leaflets or participating in a protest or receiving foreign funding for your NGO. Whatever it is, we would consider that this is a violation under international law. You can identify as a feminist, as a service provider, as a teacher, or as an ordinary citizen. Now, having said all of that, kind of, I'm talking about very practical applications. It's true that there is a difference of ideology in terms of what constitutes what your change agenda is. If you look from a feminist perspective or from a human rights perspective, it's true that you cannot convolute the two. They are not interchangeable. They have their own they have their own methodologies, their own foundations, etc. But I think that what's been really interesting for me at the UN level is to see how the two can work together, to see what the contributions are, and I think also how feminists and feminist organizations and feminist movements have helped to push the human rights defenders framework to where it is now is, I think, a really kind of an important discussion to have. And I think that Carrie will unpack this more, including, asking some very important questions as to what actually is feminist engagement at the Human Rights Council.
Thank you very much, Pooja. That was really interesting and helpful. And maybe we can move on to Carrie now from Sexual Rights Initiative, Geneva. Hi, Carrie. So I will give you the floor for you to discuss maybe where Pooja leave, like what does in general like feminist activism looks like at the UN, whether it's indeed possible to do feminist activism at the UN level or to what extent it's possible. I think Pooja said something really interesting, saying that what we are facing at the national level, like authoritarianism, patriarchy, or heteronormativity, whatever it is, that's somehow mirror at the UN level. So that also means UN is a patriarchal and heteronormative space. So do you think it's possible to do feminist activism there?
Thanks, Duru. Yeah, so really easy questions to address this afternoon, I think. Let me start by introducing myself. So my name is Carrie Shelver. I'm an activist from South Africa. I have a long history of doing sort of feminist troublemaking on a bunch of different issues in pursuit of social justice. And actually it's only been, and even though in those years, Of course, we were looking at all the possibilities within these different regional and international systems. It's really only been in the last 4 years or so since moving to Geneva that I've really had this kind of real close look into an opportunity to test out what feminist activism looks like in the UN. And so many of the ideas I think I'll share are a little bit experimental in some ways, and also probably raise a lot of questions more than give answers. But right now I work for a feminist coalition called the Sexual Rights Initiative, as you said, and we're working to advance rights relating to sexuality and gender in the UN. And I guess that first question, is feminist activism in the UN even possible, is a really important question. And I think for myself, even previously, probably the idea of doing feminist activism in the UN seems at best futile. And at worst, probably fueling the machine's credibility. And the machine here, I'm talking about the UN system. I think there's so many problems with the UN and how it functions. Pooja mentioned some of them, and I have a habit of going back and repeating many of those, possibly too much. But I think it is important just to give that context, right? And so, I think even to think about embarking on a political project of disrupting power within the UN can seem quite insane, actually. And yeah, I mean, as I said, I would never have imagined myself even 4 or 5 years ago to be doing this every day. And I guess I'm still trying to figure out what it actually means, to do this kind of work in the UN. And I guess so. Maybe as I talk, probably the question that most people will be thinking is, well, why bother? Why are you doing it? And I'd say that because the UN is a space of power, it's a space where power, ideas, arguments, and decisions are contested, most often without the very people who will be most impacted on by what happens there. And any place like that is a place for feminists, I would argue. And I think it was really interesting to hear Pooja's account of the kind of history of feminist work around the declaration and so on. And when I was thinking about this question of feminist activism in the UN, I was thinking about the kind of political work that was undertaken in the 90s by feminists, and why they chose the UN as a space for change. And of course, with hindsight, when we look at that, we could say, well, there were some problems with it, and there's no perfect feminist struggle anywhere. But I think one of the things that strikes me from what I've understood about that work was that it was so tied into and accountable to the wider political mobilization and feminist work. And I think that these histories and reasons for engagement then and where we find ourselves now are really important for us to consider when we think about what does it mean to try and sustain feminist work in the UN. Because even as I hear Pooja's account, I'm like, great, so there have been these moments, it seems, right, when there's a mobilization and an engagement around particular moments in sort of UN history, and yet perhaps one of the challenges has been to keep that in the day-to-day functioning and working of the UN system. And I'm not sure if we can say that much, that there's been significant changes since the feminists first put the UN in their crosshairs. You'll excuse that militaristic metaphor. And perhaps really what we're looking at is a further entrenchment and deepening of many of the things that were present then, and that are also, of course, reflected in the world outside. I just want to touch on a few of those, and I'll come back to those a bit later if there's time. I think the one thing around the increased professionalization of NGOs has definitely taken hold. The kind of murky donor obligations and the career opportunities have certainly pushed out perhaps some of the activists who really did see this as an activist project. And of course, not to say the sort of the all-encompassing domination of neoliberal and capitalist ideologies that have really quite successfully all but domesticated or decimated radical work. I mean, with some notable exceptions, of course, but I think within the UN, this is particularly true. And I think, Duru, you spoke about feminists working outside of the human rights framework, and I wonder where that is, and is that even possible to do work outside the human rights framework? It's become such a dominant framework and almost inescapable, particularly if one is seeking out funding or kind of recognition for the work that you do. And of course, it goes without saying that these spaces are still heavily dominated by this sort of standard of white male, English-speaking, northern, educated and elite. And the power stays largely in the hands of those classes closest to those identifiers. And I think later, if there's a chance, I'll talk just also about what a hostile space that makes for anyone who doesn't fit that description. And this is true for states, but it's true for civil society groups, UN agencies, etc. And so, it's not just about who's in the space, but it's also about what that means then, obviously, in terms of how it defines the ways of working, the agenda, the solution. And that also means that the solutions are not fit for purpose, or at least not for purpose for the majority of the world. And even to try and to do something different, and here I'm talking about, as feminists, to try and do something different, which we must do, we're often seen as naive or unsophisticated. We're misguided. We're not practical, right? We're asking for too much. This is not the place of ideals. We must be pragmatic. And where that fails, the other sort of characterization I think we often confront as feminists is that we're too angry, right? We're unrealistic. We're unstrategic. So this is kind of the current situation, I'd say, and also the circumstances in which the SRI, the coalition I work for, came into being. It was really a political experiment to see whether it was possible, first of all, for feminists from the North and the South to find common ground, and to then advance that within the space of the UN as a way to advance these rights, and with a very strong commitment to Global South feminist leadership, rooted in and accountable to feminist movements. And I think I'm not going to go too much into the nuts and bolts of what we do, but I think one thing that's really important, and I think this is true not just for the SRI, but for many feminists who find themselves in the UN, is that there's not one singular commitment or agreement around what change looks like there. And I think that's really important. I imagine that many feminists who are in the space are not sold on the idea of human rights, or certainly not on the idea of human rights as the end goal. I think that for many of us, it is important to be advancing and make advances on norms and standards, to look at these spaces as spaces of accountability. I think this is particularly true when the doors or the spaces of accountability nationally are closing down, or regionally are not available. So I think, those are really important reasons for engaging with the system. But I think for others of us, I think there's perhaps a different and I would say perhaps more interesting political project to this work, and that is that it provides us with an opportunity to disrupt and decenter the dominant ideas and power of northern narratives and agendas in these spaces. And so I would say that with that broad range of sort of ideas that really form the basis of SRI's work, that in the end, I guess, we all agree that, it's a space for very important feminist battles to be fought there. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Carrie. It was really very interesting, and I have too many questions to you. So the first one is that you said something, you mentioned about the trend of professionalism in the field of human rights. And that's also something that we have encountered as one of the main issues in the human rights field in Turkey. Many women working in the field of human rights field in Turkey, they mentioned that, like, in order to be in the human rights field now, even at the national level, you need to speak some English and preferably another language. You need to have like a good education, preferably like a master's or even more. And even like for young people to get into the field, they need to do like a bunch of fellowship, internships, have a really very strong CV in order to engage with the human rights organizations. And I think that's even more the case at the UN level. So you are working at an international organization, and somehow you play the role of a bridge between people at the local level who would like to engage with the UN mechanisms. And I would like to ask you how you ensure that you are not only engaging with people like professional human rights defenders, but also like other activists who are not maybe professionally working at an organization, but like engaging in activism in different level, so that they can come to the UN and somehow dismantle those power structures that you mentioned.
Yeah, great. I think that's great. I mean, first of all, to say that we actually pride ourselves on not being an international NGO. We're a coalition of 6 organizations spread across the world. And I think that's really important for us, that we are a coalition and that we are first and foremost sort of accountable to our members, and then the others that we work with. I think it is. I think it's a tricky role to try and play. On the one hand, I think what we're trying to do is to crack open the system, which is deliberately kept opaque and bureaucratic, as Pooja was saying. It's deliberate. It's designed in such a way to keep people out. And for those people who can get in, well, then it is those few people, as you pointing out as well, right? We see this replicated at every level: national, regional, and global. And so our role, I think, is to crack that open. Our role is also to provide information which is deliberately kept away from civil society, I think. So also to do that, there's this thing that happens in the UN a lot, where states pull you into their confidence. And they will be, they'll say things, oh, we're going to just tell you this, but we're not going to tell anyone else. And in this is a very powerful strategy, right, to both divide and rule civil society, but it's also a way to kind of keep that group of the inner circle quite small and tight. And so we see our role really as being about, if we get information, the information must be shared to the product of civil society. So I think that's really important. And to share what we have discovered can work. But our role is not to package what people say, or to tell them, how to say that and so on. And I think there's so much self-policing that happens in the space of the UN, that oftentimes it doesn't even need to be said. Right? It's not even that it has to be said. Of course, there's always the threat, oh, you're going to lose your ECOSOC. And of course, if you're there on someone else's ECOSOC status, you're implicated in that as well. That has its own sort of power, but that's not even needed, right? The kind of self-policing, the internalization of what change looks like in the UN is so dominant, that what we have to try and do is actively work against that. And I think, before I start rambling on this point, but I think one of the things that we saw, which may even be something great that's happened over the sort of move to everything being online, is we saw a lot of activists making their own statements, video statements, before the UN. So suddenly not needing to get to Geneva, not needing, to be spoken for by someone who could be in Geneva, but activists just being able to record their own statements. It's not without its own limitations, but suddenly you started seeing different people making demands in that space, and I think that's quite amazing. So I think these are some of the things that we try and do. But for us also, the power of disruption, I think, is really important. This system is one that thrives on like rituals, on coded language, of a kind of written and unwritten rules, and what that does is it keeps the patterns in place. It prevents progress from happening, because everything is happening in this highly coded diplomatic speech. We've seen what happens when disruptions happen, when states have to go off script, when something new, and I think that this is actually what we increasingly see as the role of feminist and social justice activists to be, is how do we force a different conversation? How do we create opportunities where it's not so easy for all of us to go back into this kind of received knowledge and commonly repeated so-called wisdom about incremental, slow, pragmatic, etc. Right? It's the time in the world is not for this now. I think there's some, and the UN has to respond to that, and if it doesn't, it's kind of deemed itself irrelevant if it hasn't done that already.
Thank you, Carrie. It was great to hear those words. I have also another question, and I think we can afterwards watch the video that you shared with us. So recently, as Sexual Rights Initiative, together with other civil society groups, you to start a feminist campaign called Empty Chairs that seeks to radically transform the human rights system into a body led and owned by ordinary people all over the world who set the agenda and make the decisions that are then supported and implemented by political leaders. So could you please a little bit talk about the campaign? How did it go? What did you aim at first? What did you achieve? And what are the possible next steps that you plan?
Sure. And I mean, I think the one thing to, even before we dig into the empty chairs, is to say that really it was built onto, previous attempts, right? And initiatives, not just attempts, because that implies, but other efforts to try and sort of garner spaces for feminists to be working in. And if there's time to do that, maybe Pooja later can reflect on some of that. But I think what came out so strongly already there was that there were many feminists who were located in organizations who may not have ascribed to feminism. And the real value in trying to bring people together, either in an individual basis or in an institutional frame, to try and work a little bit more collectively and collaboratively to make some changes within the UN system. And, I think we've sort of really spoken about many of the problems that exist in the UN that make it an extremely hostile space. But of course, and that's always been the case, but of course, through COVID and then these what they call efficiency measures, which is like a managerial response to a political problem of states not paying their fees, right? So in response to all of that, we were presented with these very important spaces where the chairs were literally empty. And I think this is really what gave rise to the campaign, right? And the campaign's name. The empty chairs, the chairs are empty. Even if they're full by activists, they're often not the activists from the South, right? They tend to be activists who are in Geneva. And so what we did was we came up with this campaign as a way to do that. And then, of course, along the way, which is, this really tells you that this is a feminist campaign, we started digging more and more into the problem analysis. And so it sort of built out into this very ambitious project or idea, political project and idea, which is that we want a People's Council. And when we say People's Council, I mean, of course, for some people, and I think this is, again, interesting, how can one hold a really wide range of ideas in one space, right, in one collective? But for some people, when people are imagining a People's Council, it's like literally a council. It's a space that exists. And for others, it's more of a thought experiment and perhaps a provocation to destabilize some of the ways in which the existing UN structure works. The we that I'm talking about when I say we in the empty chairs is also quite nebulous at this point. It's not, we don't have fixed membership, but it's really just on the basis of attraction. There is a manifesto that I encourage everyone to look at, which is full of like really amazing and bold ideas, and itself was quite a source of exciting debate where things like needs and rights were debated and discussed. For many people in the coalition, human rights was not the right language to be using, and rather a discussion of needs, which is an older one, was also being discussed. And of course, as always, in any good feminist campaign, is this a transformational or a reforming kind of campaign? So all of those things are all actually in the same, are held together. All these tensions are held together. And I guess maybe just to wrap up a bit is like, it is, I guess, as campaigns go, it's fairly new in its initiative, it's about a year old. But there's a very keen, I think, commitment to working with people outside of these spaces. And that has meant, of course, activists, right, who are not engaging in the UN, to ask them to help us think about what is a People's Council, what would that be? but also to collaborate with artists. And just one thing which will now sort of lead us into the video is we collaborated with artists, and it led to us staging a production in Zurich. Only because that's where the money was. So we hope to be able to take it to other places as well. And while we were working on the production, we said, well, if there's a People's Council, there must be a People's Chair. What is the People's Chair? And this was both a sort of, it became quite symbolic for us. And we were thinking about all the chairs in the UN building. It's stuffy, you can imagine, right? Overpriced, stuffy, formal. And so we thought, well, if that's the council chair, the People's Chair has to be a plastic chair. And you will see this chair featuring in the video we're about to watch. What we did was we, as part of the production, but also this is a project ongoing, we hope people who are watching this will consider making a video as well for us, is we invited people to use the symbol of the People's Chair and to tell a story through video of what their imagination would be around a People's Council. What would it look like? How could it work? And deliberately, just making that completely open. And the idea is that, people, in some ways, by sharing their ideas, we are already creating the People's Council, right? It is held in this kind of digital space until we can convene it in person. So the video we're going to watch now is one of the submissions that we received from an organization we work with, Al-Haq. I think many of you will know this, that Al-Haq has been facing a lot of harassment and really appalling treatment by the Israeli government, including now being listed as a terrorist organization. And so that's the video we're about to watch. Thanks, Duru. We can watch the video now. Yep.
اسمي هيا، باحثة قانونية في مؤسسة الحق القانون من أجل الإنسان.
وأنا هنا اليوم لأخبركم كيف يبدو مجلس حقوق الإنسان بأعين مؤسسة حقوقية فلسطينية. منذ عام 1979 ونحن نسعى لحماية حقوق الإنسان وتعزيزها في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة لتحقيق حق الشعب الفلسطيني في تقرير المصير في كافة أماكن تواجده من خلال التوثيق والمناصرة تماشيا مع مبادئ القانون الدولي. في هذا الصدد يشكل مجلس حقوق الإنسان أحد أهم الوسائل التي نعتمد عليها في عملنا بالمناصرة الدولية. وعلى الرغم من أنه أسس ابتداء لتعزيز حقوق الإنسان وحمايتها في جميع أنحاء العالم، إلا أن الواقع يعكس صورة تكاد تكون بعيدة عن تحقيق هذا الهدف. كيف نتخيل مجلس حقوق إنسان خاص بالشعوب؟ نتخيل مجلسا يحتكم للغة الشعوب وإرادتها الحرة، مجلسا يسهل الوصول إليه يراعي قيود الحركة والتفاوتات الاقتصادية بين الشعوب، ومجلسا بابه مفتوح للجميع ولذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة ولأولئك الذين لا يسمح لهم ابتداء ببناء مطار أو جسر أو نفق. نتخيل مجلسا يحظى بنسبة أعلى من ميزانية الأمم المتحدة، بحيث لا تعيق المحددات المالية التنفيذ الفعال لمهامه، كتلك التي تواجه التحديث السنوي لقاعدة بيانات المؤسسات التجارية المتورطة في المستوطنات الإسرائيلية. نتخيل أيضا مجلسا يقدم مساحة آمنة لمؤسسات المجتمع المدني يستخدمونه لإعلاء أصوات الضحايا دون خوف أو تهديد، وتكون فيه آلية الحوار التفاعلي غير مقتصرة على 10 منظمات أهلية فقط. نتخيل مجلسا لا تؤثر في عمله دول تنتهك حقوق الإنسان بشكل صارخ، كالمهاجمة على البند السابع من أجندة المجلس المتعلق بحقوق الإنسان في فلسطين وغيرها من الأراضي العربية المحتلة. نتخيل مجلسا تكون فيه الشعوب المضطهدة صانعة القرار، بينما تقف الدول الاستعمارية لتطبيقها، عسى أن تستطيع بذلك تعويض الشعوب التي عانت وما زالت تعاني من طغيانها. لماذا تشارك الحق في حملة المقاعد الخالية؟ اعتاد شعبنا الفلسطيني على المقاعد، مقاعد لم يختاروها هم بل أجبروا على الجلوس عليها، في حين سلبوا حقهم في الجلوس على تلك التي يستحقونها فعلا. لا تعكس حملة المقاعد الخالية المساحة الضيقة الممنوحة في المجلس لمشاركة الشعوب فحسب، بل تصور أيضا صعوبة استغلال هذا المقعد من قبل الفلسطينيين. فاستمرار العيش تحت استبداد وممارسات الفصل العنصري من قبل المستعمر الإسرائيلي وإبقاء الوضع على حاله دون تغيير جذري يعني تغييب الصوت الفلسطيني ومسحه من الصورة، وبقاء هذا المقعد فارغا. ليس مقعدنا فحسب، إنما ستفرغ مقاعد أخرى. فضمان عدالة دولية لا يتأتى إلا من خلال تحقيق العدالة لكل الفلسطينيين وبضمان إشغال مقعدهم بشكل فعال.
Thank you very much, Carrie. It was a really interesting video, and your presentation was really stimulating. I'm sure we will have some questions for you. So at this moment, I would like to remind all those listening to us, please feel free to type your questions or comments to our panelists. And at the end, I'm sure we will have some time to direct them to the speakers. So if you don't mind, I would like to continue with Brenda now. In the first two sessions, we talk with Pooja and Carrie about how you do feminist activism at the international level, what are the challenges, what is the main impact. And now, Brenda, maybe you can take the floor and talk a little bit like what does doing feminist activism at the national level look like when you use the Women Human Rights Defenders framework. So I would like to give you the floor now. I think we cannot hear you, Brenda.
Thank you so much, Duru, and the Women Human Rights Defenders Network would actually want to really appreciate you for reaching out, but also for having this discussion and talking about the issue of safety for women human rights defenders. I will introduce myself, called Brenda Kugonza. I work in Human Rights Network Uganda, but I'm also the founding member of the network. And yes, Pooja has talked about the situation of how at international human rights defenders are organizing and engaging to raise awareness and visibility of the situation of women human rights defenders. The Women Human Rights Network Uganda is a network of over 147 women human rights defenders. And these are women human rights defenders that come from the different parts of the country, different regions of Uganda. And the network together with diverse social movements. So typically we have women human rights defenders who are feminist activists. We have women human rights who identify as women, the LGBT activists. We have women with disabilities. We have those that are confronting oil and extractive industries. Women human rights defenders who are journalists, those and environmental, land rights, women human rights defenders across the spectrum. So ideally, I wanted to talk about this whole issue of how we started having this feminist analysis for creating Human Rights Defenders Network Uganda. The idea of forming a network for women human rights defenders for us started with what we call conversations of distance, conversations of questioning, in order to integrate what we call the feminist holistic protection approach. So we're just asking these questions and making all the people around, including civil society, uncomfortable with our demands as feminists. So I remember between 2015 and 2017, we started talking about, we found out that there was an increase of journalists against rights defenders in Uganda. And what was really touching is the fact that victims of these attacks could rarely take action for their protection. And I'm talking of women human rights defenders who are all isolated. Even when we try to reach out to the existing protection mechanisms, it was not supported as defenders. So we faced quite a number of gender-specific attacks in the struggle to really fight and promote human rights for everyone. Because we experienced, we were not recognized for our contribution, first of all. And then two, we faced a lot of office break-ins. Then there was this whole issue, we started seeing restrictive laws. For example, we had the anti-homosexuality bill at the time. We had the anti-pornography bill at the time. And all these were looking at, they were attacking the work of feminists who are dealing in sexual reproductive health, feminists who are promoting rights of workers and the LGBTQ women, feminists that were really organizing to denounce, to challenge the powers, the unequal power relations. And so I remember that at that time we were asking the different protection mechanisms and saying, I would like to know how you are integrating gender perspectives in your existing protection mechanisms. And because we're not finding the right answers, we then changed the question to, is there a specific gender-based framework with security mechanisms? And because it was very difficult to get the right answers, as feminists, we began to realize the importance of such a network of the women human rights defenders. A feminist analysis, first we pushed for the creation of what we call a feminist holistic protection approach, which ideally is about integrating a gender perspective. That is number one, which is also focusing on building supportive networks for women human rights defenders. Because we realized that even women human rights defenders who did not identify themselves as women human rights defenders or feminists, or they just did think as was, we are getting at terms of the work because of our gender. That because of our gender orientation, identities, and that brought us together. So what we said is, like, let us also try to promote beauty works, and also needed to coordination effort of women human rights defenders from diverse social movements and causes within Uganda. Because you'd find that women human rights defenders, for example, who are involved in land rights, and those who are really working on sexual minority groups were disconnected. But so we said, how do we ensure that we create coordination among those women HRDs from different social movements? And so in 2017, the Women Human Rights Defenders Network Uganda was launched. And it was launched with the aim of trying to do alternatives of protection, self-care, and security in order to respond to violence that women human rights defenders face, arising from our work, but also our gender. And so that is how the Women Human Rights Defenders Network Uganda was. I think I can stop at that.
Thank you very much, Brenda. I would like to start with a question about the feminist holistic approach that you mentioned. Could you please elaborate on this a little bit? What does it mean in practice?
Okay. Wow, thank you so much. Yes, that's a question that we always get. So ideally, the feminist holistic protection approach, for maybe our listeners out there, it is about taking deliberate action in terms of inclusion of a gender perspective that recognizes violence, discrimination, and inequality happens to women human rights in both the private life and the public sphere. So this approach actually acknowledges that violence connected to our work, which is human rights defense work, carries a close relationship or is connected to gender discrimination. Most existing protection mechanisms do not recognize. Once a child has a component of gender discrimination in that, and that is what the approach acknowledges. Then the approach also acknowledges that human rights defense, in as much as we suffer the same attacks as our male colleagues, the human rights defenders, but sometimes the attacks that are specific to us, like sexual assault, which we must recognize, and that happens in different ways. So the idea that the feminist seeks to contribute as a movement that is going to ensure that we create protection strategy can address the protection needs of women human rights defenders, and then also that can also take into consideration of elements of self-care to deal with exhaustion, burnout, and then stress for women human rights defenders. So that's what the approach we are trying to promote as the Women Human Rights Defenders Network Uganda.
Thank you, Brenda. That was really helpful. I'm also curious about, like, you said you have established the network in Uganda in 2017 officially, right? So what was the response from the other actors in the human rights field? Are you engaged with other human rights organizations operating in Uganda, and how did they approach to you? Are you being able to work with them, or what's the relationship there?
Okay, well, I think that I'm a feminist, and I don't apologize for being a feminist, and I don't apologize where there are inequalities. And I must say that broader rights organizations and civil society organizations, or really broader human rights movements, still have patriarchal ideologies. I will tell you that sometimes the existing protection mechanisms either recognized women human rights as victims in their action, or they were actually integrating gender as just a cross-cutting issue, and therefore not recognizing the root causes, which is actually power dynamics that cause violence against us. So that we were not trying to reinvent the wheel. And so we appreciated the work of other civil society actors and the existing mechanisms. But trying to do, or what we are doing, is actually to articulate our own knowledge, our own defenders, and that's our other experiences and movements, because we have that understanding and the experience of actually understanding violence against us and responding to violence against us, to address the historical norms that justify violence against women human rights defenders. And that is why we created this as an alternative. Then the other thing we realized, I remember at that time, that the existing protection mechanisms, even up to now, by the way, in Uganda, do not adopt to the different roles of women human rights defenders in their workplace, in their families, in their community, in their movements and other movements. And that alone, if you don't recognize that, then you will miss out on whatever protection mechanisms you're trying to address. So, and again, the protection mechanisms really find it very difficult to empower women human rights defenders. How? We still see that the existing protection mechanisms in Uganda are struggling with the whole issue of involving women human rights defenders in processes of the process of gender. From our context, even if they have not arrested a human rights defender, or they have not broken into their offices, but the use of gender roles and gender stereotypes usually hinder women human rights defenders from continuing their activism work. So for us, we think that gender analysis, the gender risk analysis is key, that the existing protection mechanisms are still not empowering women in that. But also we find that in addition to that, the existing protection mechanisms fail to address the structural violence and its root causes of power. So they look at the contributing factors because of our work, but they forget the structural violence that we face. Having said that, we also saw that the different organs we work with, the different women human rights institutions that provide protection to broader human rights defenders, they grapple with the issue of inclusion of a perspective into their work. And that is why we say it is very important for us to develop what we to to help civil society organizations and key players to understand the perspectives of violence that we experience, to understand discrimination and inequality in both the private sphere and the public sphere. In my context, some of the existing NGOs look at the violations that we experience similar to what our male counterparts experience, but they even hardly recognize the violence we face from our families, from our communities. And so the Women Human Rights Defenders Network Uganda decided to create this kind of protection mechanism to address sections of women humans who are facing backlash from their families and communities. Most of them could not stay in their communities. So we wanted to create a platform that can really be a home for women human rights defenders.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Brenda. That was really helpful. Maybe we can come back to you at the end if there are any other questions from the audience. But considering the time, I will move to Meerim now, if you may. Hi, Meerim.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay, great.
So I would like to give you the floor without further waiting. As you know, the subject of this panel is gendering the struggle of human rights in general. And we discussed together about the framework of women human rights defenders, how we use that at international level, at national level. But we generally forget that we need to also talk about like our own structures, our own organizations, and our own movements and what we experience there as being women. So maybe I can give you the floor and you can talk a little bit about like what does a feminist intervention to a human rights organization look like, and you can talk about your experience at the Frontline Defenders.
Thank you, Duru. Hello, everyone. As I was listening to everyone else presenting, I was trying to picture the audience, and it's of course a challenge always, but I was trying to picture all of you in the room and using my imagination that we have this beautiful space together and we can still see each other. And I was also thinking about politics of language. We're using English here, and I know all of you here in the room are struggling because there is translation going on. And so that results in disconnect. And I was also dreaming about maybe, I wish there was a feminist language that we could all speak. And maybe Turkish grammar could be used for it, because I think Turkish grammar was used in the past for what was it called? Something. There was like a universal language attempt in the 80s. Anyway, so just kind of dreaming along as I'm listening to all these brilliant speakers. So I will try to speak slowly for translators, and also I have slides to help us kind of go through my talking points. So maybe if the slides can go up now. Thank you. So my name is Meerim Ilyas. I am head of protection and gender lead at Frontline Defenders. I am originally from Kyrgyzstan, born and raised there, but have spent probably the last 15 years or so outside of Kyrgyzstan. So I'm kind of international a little bit at this point. But what I wanted to talk about is what Duru just mentioned, is the experience of us as feminists, as women's rights advocates inside the spaces where perhaps the agenda is not quite feminist yet. And so we can either be either assigned to do the work of gender mainstreaming, or we're simply working for an organization that still has a lot of work to do around internal processes of equity, gender equality, intersectionality and introducing feminist ideas to the actual work we do and how we are with each other. So that's kind of what I am going to try to cover in the slides. Next. So as I'm speaking, I would like us to maybe think about these questions that I have here. I don't know where you all are in your journeys. Maybe some of you are working like me in organizations that are considered more broadly mainstream human rights organizations. Maybe some of you are actually in women's rights organizations or actually in feminist organizations. But whatever your role is, whatever your journey is, the questions I am asking us all is, when you are trying to build support for your work, for your agenda, thinking about what is the process in the organization for that. For example, does the leadership, the directors, for example, the managers, are they aligned with you? Or is it that it's more prescriptive? Meaning donors came and said, we'd like you to do more on gender equality, or we want you to have more women in the room. Or is it driven from within? Is it that the organization already internally had some thinking about where they are and deciding collectively that that there's more work that needs to be done? So that's kind of a first question to think about. Second question is, how is your role designed? Is it a specific role? Are you being brought in to help in this particular area, which was the case with me? And do you have any room for trying to adjust that role? Or is it, already a position that's set in stone that you have to fill in? Also, what are the challenges you seeing, like doing a mapping of things that need to kind of, to be addressed, but then also thinking about what were some victories, because on any journey, there's always a challenge and there's also a victory. So because that thinking about victories, thinking about the positives will help you kind of stay afloat, stay to feel that there's already positive things that happen, so you're not starting from the bottom. Next slide. Sorry, next slide. Okay, got it. And in my work at Frontline Defenders, first I want to actually give big thanks to my organization and to my colleagues. And Duru was actually also my former colleague, and played a big role in supporting when I first started. I want to thank the organization for actually allowing me to experiment with all of this and also being flexible with the ideas that I was proposing. So I just wanted to name that I was lucky in that way, because there was enough flexibility to do different kinds of things. So what I wanted to mention here on this slide is some of the assumptions that we make as feminists when we are tasked with this goal, with this purpose to try to disrupt, try to bring change, try to bring better kind of just gender mainstreaming practices and inclusion of women's agenda. First and foremost, as you all know yourself probably, even in women's rights spaces, not everyone is going to be aligned. And often what I've seen in my experience, not only Frontline and other organizations, but hearing from others, is that there's often an assumption that if we're all women, therefore we're sort of believing in the same thing. we also assume that we are coming from the same level of education and exposure around these issues, especially how we articulate feminist agendas, how we articulate our goals. And often what happens is that people who are working not directly in programs, people who are working in administrative support, people who are working in finance, people who are working in human resources and other areas that are not considered direct support, they're often not as exposed. And often because they're not engaging in day-to-day work, I think the gap then grows. So there's something to keep in mind when you're doing this work, is that everyone needs to be brought into the conversation. Second piece is that often when we're talking about gender mainstreaming or bringing feminist agendas into the work of human rights organizations, there's almost never actual power analysis. And how we bring in feminist agenda and structures of power are deeply interconnected. What it means is that often the hierarchical structures that are in the organization, they are accepted as is. So there isn't always a questioning of the actual decision-making processes. And the reason why it's important is because when we're talking about feminist structures, it's not only about our external programming. It is also very much about what's happening internally. So the power analysis has to be applied both to your internal structures and to the work you're doing externally. So if we're talking about we must engage with grassroots, we must hear from defenders, activists on the ground, but then we also not we don't always implement the same principles internally. Are we talking to people who are supporting our programs? Who's making decisions? Is it women that are making decisions? How are men involved? And those type of questions. The third one is also quite important, and I've noticed it in many organizations, is that, and it's related to the first one, this assumption that we're all on the same page and that we believe in the same thing, is that it's very important to try to find space and time to have honest conversations about difficult issues that are that exist in women's rights and feminist movement, like sex worker rights agenda, trans women, inclusion of trans women, and also looking at LGBTIQ plus agenda and looking at it as a separate thing from women's rights agenda. That's also an area that requires space for discussion, both for solidarity, but also breaking these assumptions of how we understand gender. And the final one here is men colleagues. So this is an ongoing observation of mine, that even though we assume that our male colleagues are supportive and they're there for us, when it comes to actual work around sustainability, well-being, mental and physical well-being, issues of sexual harassment that are now increasing in the human rights field, and just generally how we understand participation, decision-making, I feel that quite often I see that men perhaps are not engaging in the way they should. And also when it comes to difficult conversations, I personally believe that they should have their own spaces as well. Because too often we as women are bringing up questions, for example, of well-being and burnout. And it's a highly gendered space, meaning the leaders who are in these conversations and those who are initiating these type of engagements inside are mostly women. But men are also impacted, both in terms of burnout, emotional impact, and when it comes to issues like sexual violence, the reality is that majority of perpetrators are men. And so what does it mean for our male colleagues to engage in that? Next slide, please. And just quickly here, in terms of my own work at Frontline Defenders, so that you can see how the work started. There was a gender audit conducted before I came. And gender audit is something that you will see in many organizations, and maybe some of you have experienced it as well. It's a very tricky process because just like with any evaluations, right, it can have both positive and negative outcomes. A gender audit that happened in this case was very helpful, and partly was informed by the fact that both women's human rights defenders and other women's funds were asking frontline defenders to increase visibility and support for women human rights defenders. And someone was brought in to a feminist who to do that work and to engage with everyone, to have these conversations, to figure out what needs to be done. So here you'll see some of the questions that the gender audit had raised. And I will not go through all of them in the interest of time, but I'll just point out a couple that I think are interesting for us to consider. So there was a, under 4, there was a question whether there is a need to hire someone specific who would have a gender hat and carry that role. And it's an interesting experimentation because there are pluses and minuses to that approach, right? If you have someone who sort of comes in and is perceived as someone who is going to sort of solve the problem, that can be a lot of pressure, especially if that someone is not given enough power sort of to move things around as quickly. So there is that debate ongoing whether it's useful to have a separate person or it should be shared across. Another one that the number 5 was interesting because, and I think it's a challenge for many other organizations where the leadership, let's say you have men as leaders. Let's say if you have 2 top executives as men in the organization, where it's mixed gender, so you have both men and women working, and sometimes also gender diverse non-binary people, but mostly we're talking about that dichotomy. So what are the optics, right? And I think it's a case with a lot of organizations in Europe as well, where you see the top management being from being European white, or being predominantly men, and you have sometimes support staff who are mostly from Global South. So those are sort of, this is not to say that it's the work that's being done is not good, but it's just something that creates tensions because of this what's called optics. How is the organization being seen from outside, separate from the actual work they do? So it's a challenge. So those are the pieces that were brought up in the gender audit, and then one of the recommendations, as I mentioned, the under number 4, the position was created and I was brought on board. Next. So this is just a snapshot of what the work that was done or being done at the moment. So when I came on, I started drafting kind of a plan based on the gender audit, based on the conversations with the staff, based on conversations with outside partners, to figure out sort of how to map out this journey, knowing that we're not going to get all of this done in 1 or even 2 or even 3 years, right? So it's going to take some time. But again, I will not go through all of them and just pull out a couple that were might be relevant to this space. First and foremost, what I learned, and I'm very firm about this, is that we have to do work internally and externally. So on one hand, I had to look at our programs and our grant making and our outreach, our statistics, and see where we are. Do we support enough women defenders? Are we engaging with them in the quality, in a way that's inclusive of their experience? Are we reflecting on their protection needs? But then also internally, like, is everybody, what are the learning gaps? What are some things that people want to understand better and they haven't had a chance? So there was a set of trainings that we put together to make sure that we're also having internal conversations. And one of those processes was around what's broadly called safeguarding, but what it means is that safeguarding is, in this case, was a situation of increasing number of violations involving sexual harassment and sometimes sexual assault that were taking place in the human rights space. I'm talking about situations where a perpetrator perhaps has been known as a human rights defender or as an activist himself or herself, and there have been reports that this person engaged in sexual harassment or even sometimes sexual assault. So that was a process, a long process, but what we needed a response, internal response to cases like this, because we are international organizations that supporting human rights defenders. So we had to really go through a process of understanding, both learning about sexual harassment in general and what is and what is not, but then also figuring out a system by which we can then navigate how to respond to these cases. So there's actually a summary of that online, and I can share it later with Duru so she can share with you all. But the full document is an internal document. We also looked at the question of leadership in the sense of, again, what is the role of the top management and the executive director in all of this, and how to bring in their voices, their visibility to validate the process, right? So what I mean by that, in an ideal world, let's say if you have a executive director who maybe is not calling himself or herself a feminist yet, but is committed, is finding ways to engage consistently in order to address the optics and to show the world that we are committed and these are the type of things we're doing. As well as, like I said before, engaging with people in programs and support roles to continue unpacking some of the questions that are coming up. And one of such questions is the idea of threats, the relationship between threats, attacks on human rights defenders, and protection. Something that both Pooja and Brenda talked earlier is, what is the experience of women human rights defenders when it comes to protection and how we define protection needs? And one of the sort of male-driven perspectives around protection is that it has to involve more extreme forms of attack, right? So violent arrest, beatings, and sometimes killings. For a number of reasons, this may not be the experience of women human rights defenders. Quite often they experience attacks that are more nuanced, more subtle, and harder sometimes to see, or not validated as threats. So those are the areas that are specific to women human rights defenders that we had to explored together as part of this kind of gender sensitive approach. Next. So just quickly, and I'm bringing up the slide because I think I see it also in a lot of other spaces, is that, and it's often driven by donors as well, but this idea that basically numbers is not everything, is never a full picture. So there is this notion that when people look at reports and statistics, if we say, well, we had X number of women in this training, or we had X number of women in this meeting, or X number of women received grants, right? There's this assumption that, well, we address gender, right? So that's not true. Because so gender impact does not equal increased number of women. It's also about, it's just so much more. It's about what kind of women were in a room, what kind of conversations that took place. Was it a women-only training, and things like that. So again, just to kind of mention this, because in my work, for example, often there's a question, well, we give 30% of grants to women, the rest are for men. Are we not doing well, right? But then the question is 50-50 the goal? So that kind of moving away from numbers and looking at who we are outreaching and what kind of women, human rights defenders we're reaching out to. And next. And this is my final slide. Again, thinking positively, thinking about from all the challenging sort of experiences, what are the opportunities that are coming up? One of the positive things in this process, in terms of trying to kind of align colleagues and have some trainings, have some conversations about difficult topics, is that it's just really created an environment of people willing to be vulnerable and asking questions. And when you bring up difficult topics and you create space, it helps people to feel closer. And the positive outcome is now that, at least from what I'm seeing, is that now when there's some activities that are being done, I can already see that people are sort of know what to do, right? So there isn't a conversation about, hey, Meerim, what do you think about this? Things are already happening the way they, you know, I want them to be without kind of me engaging. And that's a beautiful moment. And I think a big conversation is about COVID-19 and the increase of gender-based violence against women, against non-binary people, the sort of the way the Me Too movement, the global Me Too movement, is still active and alive, and how we're supporting that. So, you know, COVID-19 conversation is ongoing and is a gendered space, right? That's why I'm mentioning it here. You know, how women support each other and others, the fact that the impact of violence increased against women. So, so those are just kind of some of the things that that I wanted to mention in terms of both lessons and some of the positives. Yeah, I think I'll stop here. You know, I'm not covering everything, but I hope it was interesting.
It was very interesting, Meerim. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a couple of questions for you. And the first one is basically about the terminology of what you are doing. It's what you explained to us in many different contexts have been named as gender mainstreaming. And this term has been also criticized for many reasons. Would you call what you have done at FLD, at Frontline Defenders, as a gender mainstreaming of the organization, or do you prefer to call something else?
Mm-hmm. No, great question, Duru. So I think I have sort of two versions of what I'm doing. So depending on the space, right? I think I would probably call it feminist disruption if I was sort of just speaking with you all like as feminists. But at the same time, and I personally also just avoided using gender mainstreaming for a while, just like yourself, just having all kinds of issues with the term. But I came to a realization in the end it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter in the context that I'm in, because if the goal is to try to get people to open up and start talking about some of these issues, and what does it mean to bring in gender equality into their work and within themselves, and if they want to call it gender mainstreaming, I'm fine with that. The nuance of the terminology, though, is that when we say gender mainstreaming, it implies incorporation. It implies add on to an existing process, right? It doesn't imply disruption. It doesn't imply that we're calling for a complete overhaul or reconfiguration of the very structures that cause gender inequality. So we just have to be careful with that. So it's kind of like a big kind of bucket term, can mean different things, but just being careful that it's not does not mean that we're calling for big change. Now, but it does have a higher chance of acceptance, right? So if I say I'm here to do a bit of like gender mainstreaming in our programming, it's going to be perceived differently than, hi, I'm a feminist, I'm an angry feminist, and I'm done with this, and I just really want to disrupt, right? Not going to work. And also in these processes, when we say gender mainstreaming, I think also what happens is that then it dilutes responsibility. It becomes mainstreaming, right? It becomes this broad thing, and so everybody feels that, well, maybe I can do a little bit, but often it's important to also name what is the accountability process for this whole gender mainstreaming thing. So details are important.
Thank you, Meerim. Thank you. That was really helpful. I have two more questions to you. And for the first one, I would like to refer again to our research findings in Turkey. Because one of the main research findings of our project is that in Turkey, as you know, there is this issue of shrinking space of civil society, where we face like growing number of attacks and threats and rights violations coming from the state authorities, including judicial harassment, arbitrary detention, etc. And that's being considered as the main threat against human rights defenders and women human rights defenders operating in the field. Yet, what we have found out during this research is that in many occasions, actually, the discrimination and violence, including sexual harassment, mobbing, or other kinds of abuse of power, coming from within the human rights field against women human rights defenders, let's say, like a woman working in a human rights organization is subjected to mobbing. Sometimes this has even like a more destructive effect on the women human rights defenders when you compare with judicial harassment, for example. And we realize that we miss that like how it can affect actually the woman in the field. So I would like to ask you, based on your experience, because I assume you have worked or witnessed like women operating in this field and have subjected to those kinds of behaviors and attacks inside. How do you think this affects women? And do you think this really comes to a point where they basically leave the human rights field and stop their political struggle?
Excellent question. I wish we had another 2 hours just to focus on that, right? So listen, I think the reality is that for women, the work we do is personal in most cases. especially women who are in leadership roles, for example. And so I have been seeing kind of the trend of dropout, right? So women are dropping out of the field, not returning. So it's a very worrying trend. And because the work is personal, we're dealing not only with the ongoing external threats from the state, from the public, from the community members, from our own families, right? We're also trying to carry sort of this like higher goal on our shoulders on behalf of women, right? On behalf of womanhood. And the reality is that even in what we call progressive countries, the situation is not great for women's rights. We're still talking about abortion rights, right? In the US, for example. So, I think I will speak from a funder perspective, from a perspective of an organization that supports women human rights defenders, is that two things. One is that we must continue committing to sustainable structures for women human rights defenders when it comes to structures for healthcare, structures for salary that's actually sustainable, structures for pension, structures for childcare. So without that, is just set for failure. So that's very important. Second is that those of us who are funders who support women activists on the ground, second is accepting that women activists are human beings who need breaks, right? So if someone is saying, I really need a break, that does not mean that person has failed. It's being patient about someone who is going to say, I'm going to check out for 6 months, and still welcome them back and create structures to bring them back. So there's a lot more to say, but I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Meerim. That was really, really nice to hear that. I have one final question for you, and it's again about Turkey, actually, because what we have observed in Turkey is that there's a trend of drafting code of conduct and policy papers on to tackle with sexual harassment, mobbing, and other forms of abuse of power in the human rights organizations. And it's a growing trend, I can say. We understand that it's coming from the requirements of the donors on the one hand, and yet some people are really welcome this self-regulation practice, thinking that it can bring at least some change. But while others are having serious concerns about the sincerity of it, or whether it can those policies by themselves, like drafting those policies one way or another, whether they are by themselves enough to bring a real gender equality to an organization, as you basically explain the process. So I would like to hear your opinions on this self-regulation practice.
Thank you, Duru. That particular question I think about a lot, actually, and I've engaged with other organizations on this. When I talked about, during my presentation, I talked about power analysis. So when it comes to policies, power analysis, understanding of power is deeply connected to how policies are going to be introduced and whether they're going to be integrated or not. Second piece is that I think at this point, almost every organization needs to have a process and a policy for how they're going to address conflict. So what is the guiding principle to understanding internal conflict? Again, so between power analysis and policy on conflict, then, only then, I think we should then move to all the other policies that are required. Because all of them interconnected, and with conflict, especially in the context of burnout, in the context of this ongoing onslaught of threats, right? People are more likely to find themselves in emotional situations, right? And so at the same time, there's ongoing issues of who is the decision maker, who can we trust, right? For example, in many cases of sexual harassment, is the board was engaged in very in ways that was questionable, right? So I think the process for conflict resolution and having an honest conversation about how we're going to approach different moments when they happen, and only then all of these other policies, because otherwise what happens, people just copy from each other and then sign off, and you're supposed to sign it, and there's no ownership over the process. So,
thank you very much, Meerim. That was all great and triggered to many thoughts and new discussions for us. Before we close the panel, actually, as I said, we receive some questions from the audience. So, since our time is a little bit limited, I will ask each one of you one question. And the first question is for Pooja and Carrie, actually. And the question is, what types of feminist interventions can be imagined in order to change, at least partially, the very bureaucratic functioning of UN mechanisms? A quite broad question and a difficult one, but it's either Pooja or Carrie start.
I think this is that moment where we both look at each other and go, who's going first? I mean, I think it's exactly some of what we've shared, you know. I think, so I do think that, you know, this new idea of the Empty Chairs campaign, but also some of the initiatives before. I think, you know, I think the containers that we choose to do the activism, of course, it's important, like what those things are, whether those are organizations or coalitions or whatever else. But I think that there are some principles that have come out even from today's conversation that have been really important and useful to help us think about what would good feminist activism look like in those kinds of spaces. And I think, you know, really holding some of these tensions and these discussion, these kind of like the questions that I think feminists are grappling with in Turkey, like what does it mean to use this framework of human rights? What does it mean? Is it different? How is it different from feminist frameworks, etc.? I think those kinds of conversations are so critical and have to be placed at the center of whatever we try and build, actually, and they should be welcomed, I think. So I think this is one part of it, but I also think like really thinking through this question of how can it be most useful to the work that's happening outside of the UN? I think that for me really is absolutely critical. You know, how we have to, I mean, I think also one of these old ideas that there was a possibility to work on the inside and work on the outside. I think capitalism has taken that away from us. We're all on the inside, basically. And so then we just located in different points of the struggle. And we need to see where the opportunities are to actually enhance each other's work and strengthen that and begin to see these as connected in ways that I think we can still improve on.
Pooja, would you like to add something? Or
yeah, I just you know, Carrie already said earlier on that the fact that the UN is bureaucratic and heavy, it's also by design. It's not by accident. It's not something that we're going to be able to fix or go away, because I think that it is the way it is for a very political reason. States have made it part of their business to make sure that it doesn't function to its maximum capacity. And so I think that there are various different philosophies here, and depending, and just like Carrie said, you know, it depends on kind of where you are situated. There is the philosophy of, okay, you know, learn the game so you can play it too. Learn the rules of procedures inside out, you know, learn how to kind of who you need to talk to and where you need to be, etc. And you know, that's kind of part of the philosophy. And on the other side, of course, there is the also very legitimate view that the master's tools are not worth knowing, and they're going to get us nowhere. And in between there is a number of different engagement strategies and possibilities.
Thank you, Pooja. Can I just add like a follow-up questions to you, both to you and Carrie? If, let's say, like women human rights defenders from Turkey or human rights organizations from Turkey would like to engage in the UN, who is having difficulty to overcome this bureaucratic side of UN, how those people or organizations can engage with you, how this relationship is built. Maybe you can also talk about this so that if in the audience there is someone who would like to reach out to you, they know how to do it.
I think what we usually answer to that is that I think sometimes it seems like they aren't, that the possibilities for engagement are quite limited. And it is true that, that there are these challenges around that. But I think also, I think one of the things that we see ourselves as being able to do is really show like what are all those possibilities and all those opportunities for engagement. And so people engage with us. Sometimes they come in and they're like, we are, we know that our country is under review. Can we work with you on that? So sometimes it's like this kind of thing, a country review process. Sometimes it's because there's a crisis. What can they do in terms of the various mechanisms and how can they use those? So I think it really is, there's no one answer to that. But what I would like to say is that, I think for us in Geneva, particularly, this is true, that actually this is the purpose of us being in Geneva, is to create access and opportunity. And so, I think really just to encourage people to reach out to us and maybe we can even find some new opportunities, right? Or new ways of pushing and disrupting. I think disrupting is the word of the day.
It is, definitely. Yeah. Pooja, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the simplest answer is just send us an email. It's not anything more formal than that. Carrie and I were in the business of trying to expand this space. We're in the business of trying to make sure that this is not an exclusive space. And also to bring in actors who might not have historically played a role in that space, and to see if there is something in that space that could serve as a hook for them. I'm sorry if you hear any screaming in the background. Those would be my children.
No worries. They are really cute sounds, so it's fine. Thank you, Pooja. Thanks very much. So maybe I can talk with Brenda, and there's a question for her as well. And the question is again about this holistic feminist approach. And they are asking, how can a holistic feminist approach help us deal with violence, discrimination, or mobbing we face from other human rights defenders or within our human rights organizations?
Yeah, for that question, one stage approach actually helps us to address the root causes of violence against women. But ideally, like I said, this approach helps us to develop alternative protection approaches that meet our specific needs. Now, in that case, women human rights defenders who report attacks against them should, in Uganda, I remember women human rights defenders who talked about how they are called bad mothers, spoiled women, marriage breakers. When they reported to existing protection mechanisms, they were not heard. And they were told, those are minor things. You women are cowards. But we are saying, for in the feminist protection, when someone comes with a claim as a defender with attention, then also the approach will also help us to define, to provide support for self-care and well-being, because increasingly women defenders like you, they are struggling and suffering from burnt out, exhaustion, and stress. And that approach helps us to recognize that, which the existing protection mechanisms rarely demonstrate that. But then also the approach helps us to kind of mobilize for solidarity for protection at all levels. So that is where we are calling for building supportive networks for women human rights defenders. Regional defenders for their rescue. So I think that is the reason why we are pushing for this feminist holistic protection approach. And then having said that, from my experience, I'll tell you the Women Human Rights Defenders Network Uganda has been able to inspire different women human rights defenders protection coalitions within the region. So we have what we call the Tanzania Women Human Rights Defenders Coalition, and then we have the Malawi Women Human Rights Defenders Coalition. And again, we are all building these networks to provide what we call a feminist holistic protection approach for women human rights defenders.
Brenda, may I ask you a quick follow-up question? You said engaging with other women human rights defenders in your region, but are you also in touch with other women human rights defenders networks from other continents, or those who are working internationally? Are you cooperating, for example, with ISHR, with Pooja, or like at a Sexual Rights Initiative? How do you work together? How do you cooperate? I think you are muted, Brenda. Oh, sorry. I think you are muted.
As our work, and that is what we promote, what we call advocacy to enhance ability, women human rights defenders work, enhance the situation of women human rights defenders at an international level, at regional level, for different audiences and policymakers to understand the challenges that we face, but also the contributions that we make. So we have actually worked with the Pooja, International Services for Human Rights. So first of all, to get the skills of engaging with a very complicated system at the UN. So they have actually worked with us. And also, how do you engage with the CEDAW committee? How do you engage with the UN Council? How do you engage at the African Union? So Pooja has been helpful with the team to support the Women Human Rights Defenders Network Uganda. We have worked with the Meerim before she even, I think, Frontline Defenders, if I'm not mistaken. She has been building us. We need this sisterhood. And we worked with Meerim, we worked with AWID. They all came to support us as women human rights defenders. So this, I want to encourage my fellow colleagues from human rights defenders to engage with, so willing to support us to grow our networks. We have worked with, I'm part of the Feminist Republic. It is we call it the Feminist Republic. It's a platform for the African women defenders. And again, these are all initiatives that are trying to promote a safe working environment for women human rights, engaging us to promote actions for women human rights defenders that need support from Uganda. So I think that is very key, because when they reach out to us, they are trying to find out what recommendation we give from a gender perspective, so that they can actually support women human rights defenders. Because sometimes they think maybe this woman rights defender don't qualify to get support, but after our recommendation, they realize and they support. So we've worked with quite a number of organizations, including Gaude of International, and with the Pooja, Meerim, and Amnesty International, they have also supported us with what we are calling push gender response responsive human rights defense. We also have wrapped these policies and the legislations that are in the making. So that's how we have been able to work with them, and we have of human rights defenders, and also our sisters from other regions. Like, I don't know if you've heard about Mesoamerican Initiative Human Rights Defenders, and issued press statements jointly where women human rights defenders have been affected here, and it is very unsafe for us as an organization to come out with this statement. So safety. Yes, and that is all I wanted to say. So I'm saying I think it is very critical for the Turkey to come up with a network, if it is not there yet, for women human rights defenders. I think to address all the issues you're raising through your questions to us, I'm thinking that it is critical for you to come up with this search network for Turkey. Why? Because of the issues around capitalism, patriarchy is still real, issues of authoritarian regimes, and then also the role of private corporations in attacking women human rights defenders. So I think you still are operating in that context, and that necessitates you people to create or establish human rights. And you have all the support from women human rights defenders networks from all the continents. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you. I think this will definitely trigger too many discussions in our field in Turkey. So I have one final question to Meerim coming from the audience. And Meerim, your question is, what are your feminist methods to open up a space of dialogue and mutual interaction between different grassroots feminist groups and LGBTQI+ groups, which may have been very contentious relationships and difficult political debates?
So I'll just think about, what I saw that maybe worked well or in this type of situation. And what the question is very good, because this is exactly what's happening, right? Sometimes we are our own worst enemy, in the sense that, again, due to the reasons that we talked about earlier, burnout and a lot of things, is that we're not able to create space for just sitting with each other, right? So speaking of spaces, I think ultimately this is where the need is, and which proves difficult, again, because of the pandemic, whereas before we had those opportunities. I also think that, and people may disagree with me, sometimes engaging in activities that are not necessarily directly connected to the very issues that one works on. So, for example, engaging on the activity that has to do with climate change, recycling initiative in your own town, going to an orphanage and spending a day with kids there, right? But doing it together sort of allows for kind of a bit of equalizing, and taking yourself out of where you've been, and creates an opportunity to create these kind of like touch points, where everyone can relate to it, because we're all human rights activists. So kind of creating opportunity to take yourself out a bit of where you've been, cooking, and creating these touch points. I think I've seen, at least in Central Asia, I've seen beautiful ways where, let's say, LGBT defenders and the more traditional women's rights groups kind of came together. So that's, I'll just stop here. It's a big question. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Meerim. Thanks a lot. So I think if we come to the end of our panel, I would like to open up the floor for if any of you would like to make any final remarks. Otherwise, we can say goodbye and hope we can see all of those joining tomorrow in our second session on, again, gendering the struggle for human rights. So, Carrie, Brenda, Pooja, Meerim, any final remarks? Or?
I just wanted to say that, until very recently, we all thought we were going to be there in person and to see all of you and to be with you in the same room and to kind of feel your energy, etc. And I think that it's really telling kind of in what context we all have to continue to do our human rights work, our feminist work, in what context we continue with our struggles. And that I suppose one thing that is really promising is that whatever the context, we try to address those challenges in the best way we can. So I'm really happy that we still were able to hold this panel under these circumstances as well. And thank you very much to Özlem and to Duru and to Özgur as well. And it was a really enjoyable panel. It was really great to have these discussions. And I really hope to see you all in Turkey soon.
Thank you, Pooja. Anyone else? Okay, then I will close the panel, and I would like to thank you, all of you, very much. It was an incredible panel for me, and it was my first moderator experience, and you all did help me a lot. So I hope I see you tomorrow in our next session on gendering the struggle for human rights. Thank you very much. Have a nice day or night, evening. Bye.
Bali.